one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. Where is the wreckage of Amelia Earhart's plane?
Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanish in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Speculation swirls that there's more to the story.
How does a celebrated pilot just disappear? And there's no evidence of her plane.
She was still alive when they stopped looking. For 3 days after Amelia Earhart vanished, radio operators heard her voice, crying, begging, saying the water was rising and she needed to get out. The US Navy ignored every single transmission. They were searching 350 miles in the wrong direction. And by the time anyone figured out where she actually was, giant crabs had already started eating her body. This isn't speculation. This is what the evidence now shows. And the reason this mystery stayed buried for 87 years. Someone made sure it did. Most aviation pioneers were born into privilege. Amelia Earhart, she was born into chaos.
80-year mystery surrounding the disappearance of Amelia Earhart could now be solved.
Growing up in Kansas in the early 1900s, young Amelia wasn't interested in dolls or tea parties. She climbed trees. She hunted rats with a rifle. She built a makeshift roller coaster in her backyard that nearly killed her. Adventure wasn't just something she pursued. It was stitched into her DNA.
The ancient DNA that has been recovered clearly shows that.
But the moment that changed everything came in 1920 when she took her first plane ride at a Los Angeles air show. The second that aircraft lifted off the ground, something clicked inside her. Within days, she was working odd jobs to pay for flying lessons. Within months, she'd bought her own airplane, a bright yellow biplane she nicknamed the Canary. And within 2 years, she became only the 16th woman in the entire world to earn a pilot's license. But here's where it gets interesting. Amelia wasn't content with just flying. She wanted to redefine what women could accomplish in an era when they were expected to stay home and keep quiet. In 1928, she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic by airplane. But there was a catch. She was just a passenger. 2 male pilots actually flew the plane, while Amelia sat in the back keeping a logbook. The media went crazy anyway. They called her Lady Lindy, comparing her to Charles Lindbergh. She became an international celebrity overnight. But Amelia hated that title. She hated being famous for something she didn't actually do. So 4 years later, she decided to do it herself. On May 20th, 1932, Amelia climbed into a small red Lockheed Vega and took off from Newfoundland, heading for Paris. She brought nothing but a toothbrush, a container of soup, and 3 cans of tomato juice. What happened next would have broken most pilots. Storms battered her tiny aircraft for hours. Ice formed on the wings, making the plane dangerously heavy. Then the exhaust manifold cracked, and flames started shooting out of the engine into the darkness. Gas leaked from a faulty tank, dripping down her neck inside the cramped cockpit. Most people would have turned back. Amelia kept flying. After 15 brutal hours, she landed in a pasture in Northern Ireland. Her face was so covered in grease that a local farmhand couldn't tell if she was a man or a woman. When he asked if she'd flown far, she simply replied that she'd come from America. And just like that, Amelia Earhart became the first woman and only the second person ever to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean.
An aircraft across and be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Her family objected.
But she wasn't done, not even close. In 1935, she became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to the US mainland. She set speed records flying from Los Angeles to Mexico City. She became a counselor at Purdue University, inspiring young women to pursue careers in science and engineering. She even co-founded an international organization for female pilots called the 99s, which still exists today. But by 1937, Amelia had her eyes set on something bigger, something that would cement her legacy forever. She was going to fly around the entire world, and that decision would lead her straight into a nightmare that nobody saw coming. The plan was ambitious beyond anything attempted before. Amelia wouldn't just circle the globe. She would do it along the equator, covering roughly 29,000 miles over 40 days, the longest and most dangerous route possible. Her aircraft was a twin-engine Lockheed Electra, specifically modified with extra fuel tanks that could carry over 1,000 pounds of fuel. To save weight, she ripped out the passenger seats, the insulation, and everything else that wasn't absolutely essential. The engine noise was so overwhelming that she had to communicate with her navigator using written notes, even though he was sitting right beside her. That navigator was Fred Noonan, one of the best celestial navigators in the world. He'd helped chart Pan American Airways' first trans-Pacific routes. If anyone could guide Amelia across thousands of miles of open ocean, it was Fred. But here's where the problems started piling up. Their first attempt in March 1937 ended in disaster. During takeoff in Hawaii, the landing gear collapsed and the Electra ground-looped down the runway in a spray of sparks and shattered metal.
They were getting ready to take off. The left gear collapsed. The aircraft basically went into what's called a ground loop.
The plane was destroyed. Miraculously, nobody was seriously injured. It took months to repair the aircraft. And during that time, something crucial changed. Captain Harry Manning, who was supposed to serve as their radio operator, quietly left the crew. Officially, the press reported he needed to return to his job with the Merchant Marines. But rumors spread that Manning had lost confidence in Earhart's judgment. Others whispered that Amelia thought Noonan was the better navigator and she could handle the radio equipment herself. Whatever the reason, when Amelia finally took off again, in June 1937, she had only Noonan beside her. No dedicated radio expert, no backup pilot, just two people in a modified passenger plane attempting to circle the planet. They made it 22,000 miles without major incident, but the final leg would prove to be the deadliest. On July 2nd, 1937, Amelia and Fred took off from Lae, New Guinea, heading for Howland Island.
Howland Island was only a few miles long, so it's a very small island in this massive Pacific Ocean.
A tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Finding it would be like finding a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. The U.S. Coast Guard had stationed a ship called the Itasca near Howland Island to help guide them in with radio signals. The plan seemed solid. Amelia would communicate with the ship, get her bearings, and land safely to refuel. But almost immediately, things started going wrong. 20 minutes after takeoff, the ground crew in Lae tried to warn Amelia that headwinds were much stronger than expected. They radioed her 3 times over 2 hours. She never acknowledged any of their messages. Her receiving antenna was either broken or malfunctioning. She could transmit, but she couldn't hear responses. And that was just the beginning of the communication nightmare that would seal her fate. See, Amelia and the Itasca were operating on completely different frequencies, different time zones, different expectations. When Amelia asked the ship to take a bearing on her signal, the radio men were confused. They expected her to take a bearing on them. But the frequency Amelia had requested was completely wrong. She'd confused 750 meters with 7,500 kilohertz, a simple mistake that made direction finding impossible. The Itasca tried to explain the problem, but Amelia couldn't hear them. She was flying blind. As dawn broke over the Pacific on July 2nd, 1937, Amelia's voice crackled through Itasca's radio. Her signal was so strong that crewmen actually went above deck to scan the horizon for her plane. She reported that she must be on top of them, but couldn't see the island. Her fuel was running low. She'd been unable to reach them by radio. She was flying at just 1,000 feet, desperately searching for any sign of land. The Itasca radiomen tried everything to help her. They sent out signals. They pumped smoke into the air as a visual marker. They pleaded with her to give them more information. But Amelia kept transmitting on frequencies they couldn't properly receive, and she kept asking for responses she couldn't hear. At 7:42 a.m., her voice suddenly burst through again, frantic and desperate. She said they were circling but couldn't hear the ship. She asked them to broadcast on 7,500 kilohertz. The Itasca immediately complied, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything might work out. In the Electra's cockpit, Amelia finally heard something. The stuttering pattern of Morse code filled the cabin. Relief must have washed over her as she grabbed her direction-finding loop, rotating it to locate the signal's source. But the signal never dropped out. At 7,500 kilohertz, the radio waves were bouncing off the atmosphere and arriving from multiple directions at once. There was no way to determine where they originated. The technology simply didn't work at that frequency. Amelia called the Itasca again. Her voice was panicked now. She said she'd received their signals but couldn't get a minimum reading. She begged them to take a bearing on her and respond with voice. The Itasca tried to explain that it was impossible to take a bearing on voice transmissions at that frequency. The radio waves were scattering everywhere, but Amelia never heard them. At 8:43 a.m., her voice came through one final time. She said they were on the line, 157337, and would repeat the message on a different frequency. She said they were running north and south. Her voice was described as sounding like she was about to burst into tears or scream, and then silence. The most famous female pilot in history had vanished. But here's what nobody talks about. What if she didn't crash immediately? What if she survived? Because for the next several days, radio operators around the world picked up signals that sounded exactly like Amelia Earhart. The U.S. Navy launched the largest search and rescue operation in American history up to that point. Over 250,000 square miles of ocean were scoured by ships and aircraft. Battleships, destroyers, and an aircraft carrier all joined the hunt. Planes flew grid patterns for hours at a time, scanning the endless blue for any sign of wreckage or survivors. The operation cost nearly $4 million, which would be almost $100 million today. The world held its breath. Newspapers ran daily updates. Millions of people who had never met Amelia Earhart prayed for her safe return. But here's the problem. They were looking in the wrong place. The Itasca searched northwest of Howland Island, but Amelia's final transmission mentioned the 157-337 line. That's a navigation coordinate that runs northwest to southeast. If she was flying along that line, looking for the island, she could have been either northwest or southeast of Howland. But the Navy focused almost entirely on the northwest. Why? Because that's where the official flight plan suggested she should be. But what if she drifted? What if the headwinds had pushed her further than expected? What if she'd already passed Howland Island without seeing it? Here's the thing. A researcher named Liz Smith later calculated that if Amelia and Fred forgot to adjust for crossing the international date line, their navigation would have been off by roughly 60 miles. 60 miles in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is the difference between rescue and oblivion. And that 60-mile error would have put them southeast of Howland, not northwest. The Navy was searching in exactly the wrong direction. And here's what really makes this disturbing. For days after Amelia's disappearance, radio operators across the world reported picking up distress signals. The signals matched her voice. They matched her frequency. They came in patterns that suggested someone was deliberately trying to send messages. One of the most compelling reports came from a teenager in Florida named Betty Klenk. Using her family's shortwave radio, Betty claimed she heard a woman's voice saying she was Amelia Earhart and needed help. Betty listened for 3 hours, frantically scribbling notes in a notebook. She heard the woman arguing with a disoriented man. She heard someone say that water was knee-deep and they needed to get out. Her father reported the information to the Coast Guard. They dismissed it as a hoax. But Betty's notes were incredibly specific. She documented times, phrases, and emotional states that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. And her descriptions matched what you'd expect from someone stranded on a beach as tides came in and out. The timing of the signals even aligned with low tide on islands in the area where Amelia might have landed. The Coast Guard received dozens of similar reports from around the world. All were dismissed as ghost signals or attention seekers. But what if they weren't? What if Amelia Earhart survived the crash and spent days trying to call for help while the entire US Navy searched in the wrong direction? Because 3 years later, a British officer found something on a remote island that should have solved this mystery forever. In 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was exploring Nikumaroro, a remote coral atoll about 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. And he found something strange: human bones scattered beneath a tree, a sextant box, a woman's shoe, and an empty jar of anti-freckle cream, the same brand Amelia Earhart was known to use. The atoll sat directly along the 157-337 line that Amelia mentioned in her final transmission. If she'd been flying southeast instead of northwest, this is exactly where she might have crash-landed. Gallagher sent the bones to Fiji for analysis. A physician named Dr. Hoodless examined them and concluded they belonged to a short, stocky European man. And then he threw them away. No DNA testing, no second opinion, no preservation for future analysis. The bones were simply discarded. For decades, that seemed like the end of the story. But in the 1980s, researchers began re-examining Hoodless's original measurements using modern forensic databases, and they discovered something shocking. The bones could have belonged to a woman between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall, exactly Amelia Earhart's height. Hoodless had simply gotten it wrong, and by throwing away the evidence, he'd guaranteed the mystery could never be definitively solved. But the circumstantial evidence kept piling up. Researchers found remnants of cooking fires, fish bones, and makeshift tools on Nikumaroro, signs that someone had survived there for an extended period. They found fragments of a mirror that appeared to be deliberately positioned to reflect sunlight, a signal to passing aircraft. They found a piece of aluminum that matched the specifications of Amelia's Lockheed Electra, and they found something that explains why no bodies were ever recovered: coconut crabs. These massive creatures can grow up to 3 feet long. Their claws are powerful enough to crack open coconuts, and they're known to drag carcasses into burrows and consume them entirely, scattering bones across vast areas. If Amelia survived the crash but eventually died on that island, the coconut crabs would have disposed of her remains within weeks. But here's the detail that haunts researchers to this day. Navy planes flew directly over Nikumaroro on July 9, 1937. Just 1 week after Amelia's disappearance, they were searching for survivors, and they saw nothing. Either Amelia wasn't there yet, or she was too weak to signal, or she was already dead. We'll never know for certain, but the evidence suggests that while the US Navy was searching in the wrong direction, Amelia Earhart may have been alive on that island, desperately waiting for rescue that never came. And some researchers believe that wasn't an accident. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Some historians believe Amelia Earhart wasn't just a civilian pilot attempting a record-breaking flight. They believe she was on an unofficial reconnaissance mission for the US government. The theory goes like this. In 1937, tensions with Japan were escalating in the Pacific. The Japanese military controlled several island chains that would become strategic targets in World War II. The US desperately wanted intelligence about their military installations, but sending military aircraft would be too provocative. So what if you sent a civilian, a famous aviator on a highly publicized around-the-world flight? Someone whose route just happened to take her over Japanese-controlled territories? Supporters of this theory point to several suspicious facts. Amelia's route was changed at the last minute from westbound to eastbound. The new route took her much closer to Japanese-controlled islands than originally planned. The US government built 3 runways on Howland Island specifically for Amelia's flight. That's an enormous expense for a civilian aviation record attempt. And some Marshallese locals have claimed for decades that they witnessed a plane crash near their islands. They say they saw a tall white woman and a man being held by Japanese soldiers. One retired government investigator even found a photograph in the National Archives that appeared to show Amelia and Fred Noonan on a dock in the Marshall Islands. But here's the thing about that photo. It was debunked within days. Bloggers traced the image to a Japanese travel book published in 1935, 2 years before Amelia even disappeared. And the fuel calculations don't work. By the time Amelia made her final transmission, she simply didn't have enough gas to reach the Marshall Islands. So the spy theory probably isn't true. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a cover-up, because the US government had every reason to bury this story. If Amelia was found alive on Nikumaroro, but the Navy had been searching in the wrong direction for weeks, that would be a massive embarrassment. If credible distress signals were ignored while the world's most famous female pilot slowly died on a remote beach, heads would roll. Better to declare her lost at sea. Better to let the mystery fade into history. Better to never investigate too closely. And that's exactly what happened. In January 2024, a company called Deep Sea Vision made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the aviation world. Using advanced underwater drones and AI-powered sonar, they'd located what appeared to be a twin-engine aircraft on the ocean floor. The wreckage sits about 16,000 feet down, roughly 100 miles west of Howland Island, exactly where a dateline miscalculation would have put Amelia's plane. The sonar images show the distinctive outline of a Lockheed Electra, twin engines, the right wingspan, the correct proportions. If confirmed, this would finally solve the 87-year-old mystery. But here's what makes this discovery so heartbreaking. If the wreckage is Amelia's plane, it means the crash and sink theory was correct all along. It means she didn't survive on an island. She didn't get captured by the Japanese. She simply ran out of fuel, hit the water, and sank to the bottom of the Pacific. It means that with better communication, with the right radio frequencies, with someone who understood the equipment taking responsibility for getting the details right, Amelia Earhart could have landed safely on Howland Island. The technology existed to save her. The ships were in position. The people were ready to help. but a series of small mistakes, miscommunications, and failures to take responsibility added up to catastrophe. Amelia herself made errors. She confused wavelengths and frequencies. She removed equipment that could have helped her navigate. She took off without a dedicated radio operator. But the Coast Guard made errors too. Commander Thompson of the Itasca knew Amelia's direction-finding equipment had limitations. He'd received messages explaining exactly which frequencies would work and which wouldn't. But he didn't correct her when she requested the wrong frequency. He thought it wasn't his place to take that kind of responsibility. And so the most famous female pilot in history flew in circles over the Pacific Ocean, desperately trying to hear voices that couldn't reach her, until her fuel ran out and she fell into the sea. The woman who once said that the most effective way to do something is to just do it was defeated not by the ocean or the elements, but by a failure of communication between people who should have been working together. Amelia Earhart spent her entire life proving that women could accomplish anything men could. She broke records. She shattered expectations. She inspired millions of girls to look at the sky and dream bigger than society told them they were allowed to dream. But in the end, none of that mattered. Because when she needed help the most, the people who could have saved her were talking on different frequencies, and nobody took responsibility for making sure they could hear each other. That's the Amelia Earhart mystery. Not where she crashed or whether she survived, but how a preventable tragedy became an 87-year-old riddle simply because nobody stepped up to make sure everyone was actually communicating. The next time you attempt something difficult, remember that knowledge isn't enough. Communication isn't enough. Someone has to take responsibility for making sure everything actually works. Otherwise, you end up circling in the dark, calling out for help that never comes.